Good evening, Windsor.
This is a work of fiction. The kingdom of Allsmere, its monarchy, and all characters depicted are entirely invented and bear no relation to any real nation, royal family, or living person. Good evening, and welcome back. At 11:30 on a Tuesday night that had otherwise felt unremarkable, King Alastair of Allsmere sat alone in his private study, a single lamp burning low over a stack of ledgers he had not asked to see. He had gone to bed an hour earlier. He had come back down for water and found, instead, a folder left open on his desk by a private secretary who had clearly meant for someone else to find it first. What was inside it would end a friendship, fracture a family, and force the king and his eldest son to make a decision neither of them wanted to make. This is the story of that folder and everything that came after. The folder belonged officially to the office of the Duke of Faro, the king's younger brother, and, for 11 years, the steward of the Crown's charitable foundation. It was not supposed to be on the king's desk at all. A junior clerk, cross-referencing donor records for an unrelated audit, had noticed a discrepancy too large to ignore and, not knowing who else to trust with it, had quietly routed the file upward until it landed, unannounced, in front of the one man in the kingdom who could not pretend not to have seen it. King Alastair read slowly at first, the way a man reads something he suspects he will wish he hadn't. Donations meant for a children's hospital wing, redirected through a shell account. Signatures that were his brother's, dated on days when his brother had been, according to the official diary, somewhere else entirely. A property in the south of the country, purchased quietly through an intermediary, paid for with money that should never have left the foundation's accounts. It was not a rumor. It was not a whisper from the tabloids that could be denied with a firm statement and a change of subject. It was documentation, and documentation does not forget. By the time he reached the last page, the king's hands were no longer steady. He sat for a long moment in the lamplight, staring at nothing, and then he did something he had not done in years. He called his son. Prince Edmund had been asleep for perhaps 20 minutes, when his phone lit up with his father's name. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Something made him answer. Edmund. His father's voice was low, controlled in the particular way that meant it was being held together by will alone. I need you to come to the residence. Tonight. Now. Is something wrong with Mother? No. Everyone is well. This isn't that kind of emergency. A pause. It's your uncle. Edmund sat up in the dark, already reaching for yesterday's clothes off the chair. In 8 years of public life, he had learned to read the weight behind his father's silences, and this one carried more than concern. It carried grief that hadn't happened yet. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. He did not wake his wife. He left a note instead, the kind of note royal spouses in Allsmere had learned to write without needing to be told. Called to the residence. Don't wait up. Love you. He drove himself, waving off the protection officer who offered, because he needed the 15 minutes alone with his own thoughts before he had to be composed for anyone else's. His father was waiting in the study when he arrived, the folder closed now, but sitting squarely in the center of the desk, like something that might still be dangerous to touch. The king did not waste time on preamble. He simply turned the folder around and slid it across the desk, the way a man hands over something he wishes he could unknow. Edmund read in silence. His father watched him read, watched the exact moment his son's expression changed from confusion to disbelief to something harder and more final. It took 11 minutes. Neither man spoke until Edmund closed the folder and set it down with more care than the moment seemed to call for, as though slamming it shut might make the contents feel less real. How long has this been going on? Edmund asked. According to this, at least 6 years. Possibly longer. I won't know until the forensic accountants finish, and I've already called them. Does he know we know? Not yet. Edmund pressed his palms flat against the desk and exhaled slowly, the breath of a man trying to keep his voice level. Uncle Freddie built half his public identity on that foundation. The hospital wing has his name on a plaque. I'm aware, the king said quietly. I attended the unveiling. There was a particular kind of pain in that admission. The pain of having stood beside someone applauded them, trusted them with the family's name, while the truth waited quietly in a filing cabinet for a clerk to stumble across it. King Alastair had known his brother his entire life. They had shared a nursery, a tutor, the particular loneliness of growing up inside a family that belonged to the public before it belonged to itself. And now he was looking at proof that the man he'd shared all of that with had spent 6 years quietly stealing from sick children to fund a house by the sea. What happens now? Edmund asked, though some part of him already suspected the shape of the answer and dreaded it. Now, his father said, we decide what kind of family we are when no one is watching. Neither of them slept that night. They sat together in the study as the clock moved. Past 1, then 2, working through a problem that had no clean solution. The instinct to protect the family name ran deep in both of them, trained into them since childhood the way other families teach table manners. Scandal was to be managed, contained, spun into something survivable. That was the old way, the way the Crown had operated for generations, quietly smoothing over the failures of its own so that the public image could remain untouched. But Edmund found himself in the gray hours before dawn, unable to make peace with that instinct. If we handle this quietly, he said, if we let him resign for personal reasons, pay back what can be traced, and make it disappear the way we've made things disappear before, what does that make us? We'd be protecting the theft as much as the man. His father was quiet for a long time. You're suggesting we go public. I'm suggesting that a family that punishes its own the same way it would punish anyone else is the only kind of family that deserves the trust it asks for. We've spent years telling this country that the Crown represents something above ordinary corruption. If we bury this, we're proving the opposite, and one day it will come out regardless. It always does. The king studied his son for a long moment, and in his face was something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a father discovering that his child has grown into exactly the kind of person the Crown will need. Your grandfather would have buried it, he said. He buried worse. I know. I'm not certain I would have known how to do differently if you hadn't been sitting across from me tonight. It was, in its way, the closest thing to a passing of authority that had happened in that room, though neither of them named it as such. A king does not always hand down power through ceremony. Sometimes it happens in a conversation at 3 in the morning, when one man discovers that his son's judgment has become steadier than his own. The Duke of Faro arrived at the residence at 9 the next morning, summoned by a message that gave him no details, only an instruction to come alone. He walked in with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life assuming that whatever came next would be manageable, because everything in his life so far had been. That confidence did not survive the first 10 minutes. King Alastair did not raise his voice. He had decided, somewhere in the small hours, that anger would only give his brother something to react against, some emotional storm to weather until it passed. Instead, he simply placed the folder on the table between them and said, "Explain this to me." His brother's face went through several performances in quick succession: confusion, indignation, wounded innocence, before settling, finally, into something closer to the truth. He did not confess outright. Men rarely do, even when the evidence leaves no room for anything else. But his silences answered the questions his words wouldn't. "I built that foundation," the Duke said eventually, his voice tight. "I gave it 11 years. "You gave it your name," Edmund said, speaking for the first time. "The money came from people who trusted that name. Children's families, Uncle Freddie. People who will read about this and remember every photograph of you standing in front of that hospital. You have no idea what it costs to live the way we're expected to live on the allowance this family provides." "Don't," the king said, and for the first time his voice carried an edge. "Don't tell me about the cost of this family's expectations. I have carried them since I was younger than your daughter is now. Whatever pressure you felt, you had 100 honest ways to address it. You chose this one. There was no shouting after that. There didn't need to be." The Duke understood, watching his brother's face, that something had already been decided, and that his part in the conversation now was simply to hear it. By the end of that week, the palace issued a statement that surprised a great many people who had grown used to a certain kind of careful, evasive royal language. It did not use the phrase personal reasons. It named the misuse of foundation funds directly, confirmed that the Duke of Faro had been stripped of his patronages, his public role, and his access to any crown-associated charitable body, and stated plainly that restitution would be pursued through the same legal channels available to any citizen who had been defrauded. The reaction was immediate and, in places the palace had not fully anticipated, favorable. Commentators who had spent years accusing the monarchy of protecting its own with a different standard of accountability than it demanded of everyone else found themselves, however briefly, without that argument. Editorials noted that it was one thing for a king to demand integrity from his government and quite another for him to demand it, publicly and at cost, from his own brother. Inside the family, the cost was less easily measured. The duke's wife, who insisted she had known nothing, moved with their children to a smaller property outside the capital, away from the cameras that now waited outside every gate the family owned. The holidays that had once gathered the whole family under one roof grew smaller and more careful. The Duke himself gave a single brief statement acknowledging serious errors in judgment, and then disappeared from public life entirely, the plaque with his name on the hospital wing quietly replaced within the month. Alastair did not speak publicly about how the affair affected him personally, and in truth there was no single moment where the weight of it became visible to the country the way it had become visible to his son. But Edmund saw it in smaller ways over the following months. His father lingering a beat too long over old photographs, growing quieter at family gatherings where his brother's absence sat at the table like an extra, uninvited guest. "Do you regret it?" Edmund asked him once, months later, the two of them walking the grounds in a rare, quiet hour. "No," his father said, without hesitation. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing it." He was quiet for a few paces. "I keep thinking of the moment I called you that night. I think some part of me already knew what needed to happen. And I think I called you because I needed to hear someone say it before I trusted myself to believe it. You would have gotten there without me. Perhaps. Slower, though. And with more excuses along the way." He glanced sideways at his son. "That's the part they don't prepare you for when you're raised to inherit this. Not the ceremonies. Not the weight of the crown itself. It's the moments when the family and the duty pull in opposite directions, and you have to choose, in private, which one you actually are." In the years that followed, the incident became something the palace referred to only obliquely, when it referred to it at all. A brief, uncomfortable chapter that nonetheless marked a turning point in how the public understood the relationship between father and son. Where once Edmund had been seen chiefly as an heir waiting his turn, patient and dutiful but essentially untested, he was now understood as someone who had already, once, stood at his father's side during the hardest kind of decision a family can make and had argued, successfully, for the harder and more honest path. It did not make him popular with everyone. There were those within the older ranks of the household who felt the family had aired what should have stayed private, who muttered that discretion had once been the crown's greatest asset and worried aloud about what other secrets might now feel obligated to see daylight. But there were far more who felt something had shifted for the better, a sense that the institution they had spent their lives half-trusting had, for once, held itself to the same standard it asked of everyone else. King Alastair, for his part, grew visibly more willing to lean on his son's counsel in the years after, not as a formality, but as something closer to genuine partnership. It was a small thing, mostly invisible to the public, but those closest to the family noticed it. The king asking Edmund's opinion before, rather than after, a decision was made. The particular ease of two men who had faced something difficult together and trusted each other more, not less, for having done so. There is a version of this story that stays quiet forever, filed away in a drawer, the way so many family failures are. In that version, the Duke keeps his title, the plaque stays on the wall, and the public never learns what nearly happened to money meant for sick children. It would have been the easier story. It would have cost the family nothing that the public could see. It is not the story that happened here, because on one ordinary Tuesday night, a king chose to call his son before he chose to call his lawyers. And in that conversation, in that study, at that hour, the two of them decided that the crown they carried was supposed to mean something more than protection for the people who wore it. That is, in the end, the only kind of inheritance worth handing down. Thank you for reading. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what you took from it.